Welcome to another edition of Retracing History here on Readout Productions. I am in downtown Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, the county seat of Franklin in Pennsylvania. And the reason we're here, it's in a bit of a busy district, downtown part of Chambersburg. This is where the infamous abolitionist John Brown felt was the best place to have a supply depot for his failed raid on the Harpers Ferry Federal Arsenal and Armory. In fact, I'm just a block away from where his command post would have essentially been in the summer of 1859. John Brown, born in 1800, failed in consecutive business ventures throughout his life. But what he lacked in physical wealth, he made up for in a spiritual security. Raised in a deeply Calvinist family, Brown came to fully embrace the golden rule in all aspects of society. This disagreed with the societal norm of the still infant United States of America, where enslavement of a particular population of man, based largely on their ethnicity, was critical to the country's economy. Brown grew outspoken at the pulpit against slavery, correlating with increasing tensions amongst the states. While not uncommon to find someone armed with the Bible in a verbal crusade against slavery, Brown set himself apart by having no qualms carrying a rifle at the same time. With the announcement popular sovereignty would decide the legality of slavery in the Kansas Territory, both pro- and anti-slave factions poured into the region in hopes of swaying the forthcoming state to their side. There, electoral fraud abounded and de-evolved into violence. After appeals from several of his sons living in the area, John Brown relocated to the territory and soon drew blood. His orchestration of 5 murders in Potawatomi, Kansas made him a wanted man. He would lead Free State militias in several skirmishes over the coming years. While his name gained notoriety, he felt he had made no large gains. This is why he pivoted his holy war against slavery back east. He hoped raiding the Federal Arsenal and Armory located in the slave state of Virginia would shock the United States of America into some resolution in the slave debate. Achieving such a feat, however, required extensive organization that had to be conducted covertly. This brings both you, the viewer, and John Brown to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, an ideal spot for his raid supply depot. The borough rests upon several roads key to commerce. Chambersburg also was the home of the Cumberland Valley Railroad, connecting the region to Harrisburg and beyond. Both road and rail would be key in moving the supplies and peoples needed to conduct the raid. From Chambersburg, both components could be moved by wagon down the Cumberland Valley to the Kennedy Farm in Maryland, where final preparations would be made just a few miles upriver from Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Chambersburg was also home to several individuals sympathetic to the abolitionist movement, providing Brown with security in storing supplies and boarding his raiders before transport. One such individual was likely Mary Rittner. I say likely, as little is recorded over her sympathies with abolition. However, being the daughter-in-law of former Governor Joseph Rittner, who was a noted abolitionist, has made several historians assume her beliefs were similar. It would also explain why on June 28, 1859, John Brown checked into Mrs. Rittner's boarding house along East King Street. Since the death of her husband, the Rittner residence had been improved to accommodate lodgers in want of food and board while they conducted business in the area. Brown's alias reflected a typical patron of Mrs. Rittner, that of a mine prospector by the name of Isaac Smith. Brown was not alone, as several of the raiders would board at Mrs. Rittner's residence throughout the summer of 1859. Perhaps the longest tenured boarder was John Henry Kagi, who had been bestowed the office of Secretary of War for Brown's provisional government he hoped to establish in the wake of the raid's success. He was tasked with transferring the arriving supplies by rail to warehouses and keep inventory, an occupation made easy for the boarding house sat within sight of the Cumberland Valley Railroad yards. And what precisely were these supplies? Some 200 Sharps rifles and 1,000 pikes, as well as foodstuff and hardware to sustain the raiders in the lead-up to the raid. Kagi would keep track of all of this while residing in a house that doubled as the home for Mrs. Rittner and her daughters. One daughter would recall Brown and Kagi holding regular meetings behind closed doors, believing at the time they were plotting a counterfeit scheme. Brown tried to keep his interactions with the Chambersburg populace to a minimum, but was amicable whenever he had to engage in the public. There are several accounts of him undertaking Sunday school services, and at least one time taken to the pulpit at the Falling Spring Presbyterian Church. Brown also assisted the community by producing charcoal in a sawmill on the outskirts of town. A Chambersburg attorney would later claim that he fully believed Brown's Isaac Smith alias. While everything appeared to move efficiently, Brown desired additional assistance. While several influential individuals were willing to contribute funds to Brown's plot, none were willing to get their hands dirty with the actual fighting. Brown still held out hope that he could convince the abolitionist movement's most famed orator to take up arms. In the evening of August 19, 1859, the most famous event that John Brown is linked to here in Chambersburg occurred right behind a Reynolds Center. Okay, obviously the Reynolds Center was not here in 1859. In fact, we would have been on the outskirts, quite a distance from the core of Chambersburg, and there's a reason for this. There was a quarry on this property. Some say the property was owned by a Joseph Winters, and Winters, along with a John Watson, are two known conductors of the Underground Railroad, which passed right through here, helping escaped slaves get from the deep south through Pennsylvania and eventually up into Canada. And Watson and Winters were likely aware of John Brown's presence in the area. Maybe they did not know exactly what he was planning, but at the very least, they wanted to assist him. And when Brown wrote to his good friend Frederick Douglass to come and meet him at Chambersburg, where he was going to tell all, well, Brown hooked up with Watson and Winters and orchestrated a meeting in this quarry so no prying eyes would see what they were talking about. Now, Frederick Douglass at this point is already well known in the United States of America. He is seen as the foremost speaker for the African American community in the country. Both the black and white community of the country listen to him. Not necessarily everybody enjoys what he's saying, but they are willing to listen to this well-spoken man who escaped slavery and is now living in Rochester, New York. Douglass had known Brown since 1847, and the two had a long friendship, although after Brown did some dirty little things, let's just say, in Potawatomi, Kansas, Douglass had to find ways to keep his relationship with Brown covert. Now, he arrives here on August 19th, 1859, and when you have one of the most famous speakers in the country just showing up in rural Pennsylvania, it's going to turn some heads. So Douglass had an impromptu speech held not far from the town square in Chambersburg as a cover for why he was really here. Then that evening, Henry Watson, who, as Douglass put it, was very busy at his barbershop but willing to drop everything to assist him, escorted him down to the old quarry site to meet Brown. Brown would have also been with his Secretary of War, John Kagi, and along with Douglass came a gentleman by the name of Shields Green. Green had been an acquaintance of Douglass for the past year. Actually had run away from slavery earlier, just a few years earlier. And he actually met Brown in a private meeting in Rochester, New York in April of 1859. So, somewhere in this location, Brown and Douglass are going to meet as Kagi and Shields Green watch. And this is where he spills the beans. Now, Douglass had a rough idea what Brown was considering, and he had faintly heard about Harpers Ferry being a target. But this is the point where Brown goes in detail on how he's going to get into Harpers Ferry, what he plans to do in Harpers Ferry, including taking hostages to be able to secure his safe passage out of the valley. Now, when Douglass heard this, he was astonished. Though both men could agree that something needed to shock the nation to bring a rapid end to slavery, Douglass at this time really was not willing to shed blood. He felt this was only going to backfire on the abolitionist movement. What Brown's about to do is going to throw away years of progress that people like Douglass had been building toward. It is also in this location where probably one of my favorite quotes in American history comes from, where Douglass describes Harpers Ferry as a perfect steel trap, foreshadowing what is about to happen to Brown in a few months' time. Brown cannot be convinced from his mission, and he is pleading with Douglas to come with him. And the reason he is doing this, he wants this well-spoken order that both the white and black community in America recognize to be there when the bees start swarming around the hive, as Brown put it, to essentially rally the cause together, give it some uniformity, and give it some legitimacy. He swore to Douglas that he'd protect him with his own life, but Douglas was not going to go with Brown to Harpers Ferry. Shields Green, on the other hand, was greatly inspired by Brown's urgings, his plot. It seemed all thought out. And Green decides to join with Brown and become his most recent raider that will go down to Harpers Ferry with the rest of the 20 raiders. Brown would ultimately lead 21 raiders, departing Chambersburg in early October to join his tiny provincial army along the banks of the Potomac River. On the night of October 16, 1859, John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry began. There are multiple videos from this channel covering that raid in detail, but suffice to say, Frederick Douglass's warning came true. The raiders became pinned down and picked off by local militia before being apprehended by a detachment of the United States Marine Corps. A handful of raiders succeeded in evacuating Harpers Ferry, with their escape route taking them near Chambersburg. A particular band of fugitives, including John Cook, Charles Tidd, and Barclay Coppock, used South Mountain to screen their flight. Cook had been an asset to Brown's planning, his charm allowing himself to become familiar with the Harpers Ferry population prior to the attack. That charm was now being employed to gather food for the rest of the fugitives. But on October 26, Cook's luck ran out near Mount Alto, Pennsylvania, when he broke from the group to ask two hunters for food. The duo identified Cook and knew authorities had placed a $1,000 bounty on his head. They apprehended Cook, who would eventually be held at the Franklin County Jailhouse in Chambersburg before being extradited to Virginia. Coincidentally, the jail sits just a few doors west of the Rittner boarding house. Unaware of these developments, Coppock and Tidd ventured into town under the cover of darkness, attempting to receive aid from Mrs. Rittner. When she saw them at her door, she warded them away to avoid attention from nearby guards. Although several residents of Chambersburg provided John Brown and his raiders some sort of assistance, none ever faced direct penalties. The American Civil War, however, did come to claim the entire community as a victim. So I wasn't planning to come down here to the town square at Chambersburg, but it's only I didn't realize it was only a block from the John Brown house. So interesting other detail about Chambersburg, not relating to Brown, but relating to the Civil War, is that in the summer of 1864, a Confederate cavalry force that was under command of General McCausland actually came up here to Chambersburg to raid it. Chambersburg had been raided twice before, during the Antietam campaign of 1862. Of course, the Confederates came through here in 1863 during the Gettysburg campaign. But in 1864, a ransom was held against the town, and if they couldn't meet that ransom by the end of the day, McCausland was going to set fire to the community. Well, the number that he had put out for the town to pay was astronomical, could not have been paid, so McCausland was going in ready to burn his town regardless. I'm just taking a wild guess, no prior historical knowledge. Maybe McCausland was just tired of the Confederates had to come up here every year to raid this town for supplies, and just kind of like, okay, we're done doing this, so yeah, we're torching the whole thing. So approximately four square blocks of Chambersburg around the town square was razed by the Confederates in a brutal fire. Mrs. Rittner's boarding house was unscathed and became a refuge for civilians impacted by the burning. On August of 1865, Mary Rittner sold her residence and moved with her daughters to New England. The story which the boarding house possessed was largely overlooked until the Franklin County Historical Society purchased the property in 2002, spending several years restoring the structure to an appearance it likely had when Brown and his raiders occupied it. The house now functions as a museum, preserving a key component in the logistics of John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry. While Brown failed in his personal mission to start a holy crusade against slavery, he did succeed in startling the nation into action over its differences. though that action would ultimately claim the lives of 600,000 Americans.